A small-town high school football star is going through an identity crisis.
He was looking for what he wanted to do, who he wanted to be.
When he vanishes after a night out.
Most people wouldn't just abandon their car on the interstate.
His license and everything in there, I thought that's too weird.
It's a mystery where evidence is scarce.
They see somebody jump out the passenger side of the vehicle.
I have no idea who these people could have been.
Investigators are left stumped and forced to examine a family's controversial past.
Logan learned about his father not too long before he disappeared.
He wanted to know about this other family. I mean, he wanted the truth.
May 2016. It's 7:30 a.m. in Tumwater, Washington, about 60 miles south of Seattle, and Ginny Schindelman is starting her day. Ginny is about to head out for work at the Washington State Department of Ecology when she notices that her 19-year-old grandson, Logan, is up earlier than usual.
He was kind of a normal teenager, and he was happy at school and seemed popular. He had lots of friends. He listened to music and he wrote poetry.
Friends and family say Logan has always been a guy who could light up the room with his charisma.
Logan was the kind of guy that I think just about anybody could make friends with him, and he'd make friends with them.
He's one of those kids that was never down. He was always laughing. We were in the classroom, he was always happy. Everywhere around school, he's laughing, joking, messing with people. He's just a normal high school kid.
At Tumwater High, Logan appeared to have everything going for him.
He got great grades without doing much work, which, was frustrating to me, but he was smart.
For 2 years, Logan helped lead the Tumwater High School football team into the state championships.
We went to all his games. We froze. I froze, but yeah, we went to all of his games.
He was just a popular guy, and everybody loved to watch him run the ball. So it was just a good time for him.
And he was an aggressor for sure on football. When we were playing, he was an aggressor. When the play's going, that kid would smack people. It was awesome.
Logan grew up mixed race in predominantly white Tumwater, with a pretty complicated family tree.
I know that Tumwater has a tendency to be blue-eyed, blonde-haired, but I don't think he had a hard time being the only black person in our family.
When Ginny was in her 20s, she fell in love with an African-American man, which resulted in the birth of Logan's mother, Hannah. But the relationship didn't last, and Hannah never knew her father growing up. Then, years later, Hannah was a young single mother when she met a visiting engineer from Saudi Arabia. Together, they conceived Logan. But because Logan's father had to return to the Middle East, Logan never even had a chance to meet him.
I'm not sure that his father even knew that he had a son at that point.
When she was 23 years old, Hannah asked her mother to help her care for her older daughter, Chloe, and Logan.
Hannah lived with me the whole time since they both were born. And then she wanted to go to art school in Seattle. So we had to do the guardianship because that's how I could cover them under my medical.
Logan's mother, Hannah, lives only a few miles away in Olympia, but she has always remained a part of her children's life.
When I saw Hannah with the kids, she was always very good with them.
While he was growing up, and throughout his high school years, Logan's many friends seemed to accept him for who he was.
I don't think he ever felt that he was different because he was African-American, ever. Tumwater wasn't really like that. I mean, it was predominantly white, but minorities, they weren't like pushed out or ever treated differently ever.
But according to his grandmother, Ginny, towards the end of high school, Logan began to experience something of an identity crisis.
There was a party in his senior year where somebody was giving him a bad time about being black.
I heard that There were some racist slurs made towards Logan in a joking way, and he did not take it well.
It was a girl. She was saying he was, from Saudi Arabia, because his father's Saudi Arabian, and that he should be dancing around the fire and doing songs and just ignorant, racist kind of things.
I did hear about that through the grapevine. I wasn't at the party, and I don't know of what actually happened.
He called me, and I went and picked him up. We got home, and he said they weren't even there for me. It was just, he said, I thought I had friends, and I don't. And he started feeling very isolated at that point.
According to Logan's friends, none of them took part in the racial taunting, and none of them condoned it.
When he stopped talking to all of our friend groups, so it was just really weird that, because we didn't do anything, it wasn't us that made any comments at all.
But according to Logan's family, the damage was already done.
At that point, I think Logan definitely was feeling a little lost.
After graduation, Logan further separated himself from his friends and took drastic measures to keep them out of his life.
He was going to go to one college, and then he decided to go to another one.
That was the weird thing, is he was gonna go in a room with one of our really good friends. I guess last second he dropped out.
He came and said, I don't want to go to Eastern. And I said, okay, you don't have to go. Where do you want to go? And he said, well, I think I want to go to WSU. I said, okay, then we have to get our paperwork done.
Just a few months before the school year was set to start, Logan enrolled at Washington State University, a college with a more diverse student body, and perhaps more importantly to him, no one he knows from his high school class. Friends say that even after he went away to school, Logan continued to keep his distance.
I would try to text him, hey, how you doing, man? It's been a while, how's school going, blah, blah, blah. And he would just ignore me completely, and everyone else too.
Friends also attempted to reconnect with Logan via social media, where he opened and read the messages, but never responded to any of them.
It seemed like it was his clean slate. I graduated, I can be done with high school and all high school drama and stuff and go be an adult now.
Logan found a new group of friends at college and seemed to be enjoying himself. But by the end of the year, the good times caught up with him.
It was first year away from home, freedom, and he wasn't doing so well in college. He wasn't going to class.
His grades weren't good enough to go back, so he couldn't go back. I don't think he quite realized all the consequences of not doing any homework.
Logan returned home to Tumwater after his freshman year in college and spent the next year working odd jobs around town. Family members say he was determined to figure out what to do next with his life.
Logan took just about any job he could find to make some money. The first job that he got was, I believe, with a laundry facility where they would go around at night and pick up laundry from nursing homes and hospitals.
Logan's great-aunt Mary is Ginny's sister. She and her husband, Mike, say that Logan also passed many pleasant hours working with them on their 5-acre farm.
There were times I needed help cleaning the fields. He helped me with other chores such as ditching for power and water.
We paid him very well, sometimes $20 an hour, because we knew he was a hard worker. And he welcomed it.
By the spring of 2016, Logan is settling into life in Tumwater, but his family says he's still trying to find his way. On the morning of May 19th, as she's about to leave for work, his grandmother Ginny discovers Logan was out late the night before, and she can tell he has something serious on his mind.
He came through the house and from the garage, which I would have expected him to come from the other direction, from his bedroom.
She asked him where he had been, and he told her He had just been driving around.
He was just really nervous, which he isn't usually, kind of on a mission. And I said, well, talk to me about it when I get home from work. I figured he'd be home that evening.
But Ginny would never get to finish that conversation.
It's a big mistake, but I couldn't see it at the time.
"19-year-old Logan Schindelman comes home troubled after what he says was a night of aimless driving. His grandmother, Ginny, has to leave for work before she can find out what's bothering her grandson. When she gets home that evening, she's looking forward to hearing what's on Logan's mind. But he isn't there, and his car isn't in the driveway. Hours pass, and Logan still doesn't come home.
That's when I checked his phone. I pinged it that night. The phone was over near his mom's house, and I wasn't too worried because of where it was.
Ginny figures Logan must have gone to his mother, Hannah's house, a few miles away in Olympia, and that there's nothing to worry about.
He'd go visit her. He didn't usually go stay overnight.
When Ginny gets up the next day, and Logan still hasn't returned, she grows concerned. Logan's mom, Hannah, says she hasn't seen him either.
So even when I pinged him and it responded from over by her house, he hadn't actually been to her house. He'd just been in that area.
Panic sets in as Ginny thinks back to their conversation a day earlier and to something Logan had said.
He said, well, I had an epiphany. Epiphany is a sudden realization. You may think of it as a truth that you suddenly realize. And I said, what do you mean? And he didn't want to talk. It was too hard, evidently. Whatever he was, he had an epiphany about.
In hindsight, Ginny wishes she could have gotten her grandson to open up, but she was also aware that he was going through a challenging time in his life.
He was looking for what he wanted to do, who he wanted to be.
Ginny says Logan's distress also led him to take on a new and troubling habit.
I know he was going someplace and buying pot from somebody because he was smoking quite a bit. Looking back, I think he may have been crying for help.
Without any details, there's no way to know what Logan could have been setting out to do with his newfound realization.
Whether he was going to go meet some people and was worried about it, or if he was going to go drive away with somebody, I have no clue.
Ginny makes calls and drives around the entire Tumwater area searching for Logan. But by Saturday, 2 days after he was last seen, he still hasn't turned up. That's when she goes to the Thurston County Sheriff's Office.
She drove to report Logan missing, but the sheriff's office was not manned. And so she had to come home, and then she waited.
They don't have anybody staffing anything. And it didn't seem like a 911 call. So we went in Monday morning. I'd like to report my grandson's missing.
We get the pertinent information. We always ask for the name, date of birth. We always ask what they were last seen wearing, and then any scars, marks, tattoos, and then any associated vehicles with the person.
Ginny tells police that Logan left in his 1996 black Chrysler Sebring. Thurston County investigators run a search on Logan's license plates, and they get a hit.
The vehicle had been impounded by the Washington State Patrol on May 20th.
3 days before Ginny filed Logan's missing person report, State Patrol found his car abandoned on the highway, only about 10 miles from his home in Tumwater. Police tell Ginny she can pick it up from the impound lot.
We went out and picked up the car and, looked through it a little bit before we drove it home. And his license was in there, his wallet, his debit card, his phone, several bags of food, and everything had a little bit of money here, there, and the other place.
Logan's belongings being left in the car appears ominous to Ginny.
His license and everything in there, I thought that's too weird, so we called that detective.
When Logan's car was found abandoned, it wasn't treated as a clue in a possible crime. Instead, it was towed to an impound lot and never processed for evidence.
We call it manipulated. It's not pure anymore. It's been, different people are in the vehicle now. Things have been moved. When Logan's reported missing, he's not the victim of any kind of a crime. He's not a danger to himself or others, and he doesn't have medical issues, so it's a typical missing person case. And so that's how we treat it.
Trying to piece together what may have happened out on the freeway, investigators pore over the report on the abandoned car. What sticks out is a 911 call that came in, reporting a bizarre incident on the I-5 freeway.
They see a vehicle traveling slow on the interstate, veering to the different lanes of the highway.
According to the caller, the car hit the middle barrier and stopped on the shoulder.
He saw the driver's side door open and then close. And then he says that he sees somebody jump over to the passenger side and then jump out of the passenger side and run into the woods. They're off the interstate.
"19-year-old Logan Schindelman was missing for 3 days when police discovered that his car had been abandoned on the interstate. Detectives are trying to make sense out of a strange eyewitness report.
Most people wouldn't just abandon their car on the interstate, unless, of course, it's become disabled. I guess what made it odd was the witness saying that it was veering across the lanes of Interstate 5, and then saying that they see somebody jump out the passenger side of the vehicle and run into the woods.
But for investigators, certain items found inside the car bring this account into question.
There's some bags that have like power bars and things of that nature in it, and those bags are standing straight up. You would think, or you would assume, that if somebody's jumping over the driver's side to the passenger side, that they would have knocked those bags down or squashed them down, and they're not.
In addition, the man who jumped out of the passenger door doesn't appear to be Logan.
The description that we got was a white male and 6 foot. That's all we got.
You wouldn't look at Logan and mistake him for a tall, skinny white guy.
The eyewitness account implies that someone else was driving Logan's car that day, but evidence found inside doesn't indicate a crime.
That was like the weird thing, that somebody that wasn't him had got out of his car and that they had left like cash in the car too. It just seems weird, like you're gonna like rob somebody or like steal their stuff. You'd think you'd at least take like the cash, but like dude just left everything in there.
The eyewitness account is not verified by other drivers, so it's hard to know if what this caller said they saw is accurate.
If you're doing, you got to figure at least 50, 60 miles an hour down the interstate, you're going to get a quick glimpse of what you see or what you think you see.
Other than the single 911 call, there's no additional evidence to support this sighting. Because the vehicle was not forensically processed before Ginny brought it back home, proving exactly who was in the car is extremely difficult.
Well, I'm not a detective, but I would think that DNA evidence possibly that was in the car was lost.
I figure they know what they're doing. So, okay. There was nothing obvious in the car. You couldn't look at it and say, oh, you know, it wasn't like a crime scene in the back seat or anything. You wouldn't look at it and say somebody was murdered in here or anything like that.
Based on the strange eyewitness account, police launch multiple searches of the surrounding area.
We conducted a search starting at the bridge you see behind me, and we started a search conducted all through this grassy area here. The search was done by 6 dog teams, which consisted of tracking dogs and cadaver dogs. The search lasted approximately 6 hours throughout the day, and at the end of the day, we weren't able to locate Logan or any evidence that was beneficial to us.
When ground searches prove unsuccessful, police expand their efforts.
The searches that were done for Logan was done by air. We had aircraft that has heat-seeking information on it. It senses heat to find bodies, and nothing came up.
With no hard evidence to build their case, investigators seek out information from those who knew Logan best. They check into who Logan had spent time with in the past year and discover that he kept mostly to himself.
I never met any of his friends or coworkers from after he got back. If he met up with them, he went someplace and met them. He did spend a lot of time at home. He was watching movies and listening to music and in his room quite a bit.
It doesn't seem that Logan was making new friends at work, so police wonder if he looked elsewhere to make connections. His grandmother, Ginny, says Logan was meeting people online.
He had a couple people he'd met that way, but he hadn't actually physically gone and met up with them.
Police find one girl Logan had been talking to through a dating app.
She lived in Oregon. She did say that they were communicating.
But the online clues don't lead police any closer to understanding what happened to Logan.
The young lady that he was corresponding with said he'd never made it down there, that she had never met him.
At a loss for where to look next, detectives turn back to the 911 dispatch calls, searching for anything suspicious and related to Logan. They discover that on May 21st, 2 days after Logan went missing, police received another bizarre call from a driver traveling parallel to the I-5 freeway.
A caller that was traveling around Pauline and Case Road saying they saw a black male without any pants on.
Off of that area, there's quite a few houses where they're known crack houses, and somebody saw a man, and they thought maybe it was Logan.
This naked young man is seen stumbling on the woodsy road. To investigators, a lead like this often indicates drug use.
It probably would mean he'd gotten involved in something really, a lot of crack and heavy drugs, and I just don't believe he did that. Am I being Pollyanna? I don't know.
Theory being that maybe he might have OD'd or maybe committed suicide. But they searched with dogs and did not find anything.
It's another sighting that goes nowhere.
We've followed up on leads in our area, or even leads that have been out of the area. We've had other agencies look for Logan, and nothing's come up.
Still searching for any concrete evidence, investigators trace Logan's cell phone records in order to reconstruct his last known whereabouts the night he vanished.
He was traveling southbound on the Interstate 5. It travels down to the Camas area down in southern Washington. And then we have the phone traveling again, then northbound up into the Tumwater area till about 3. And then 3:45 in the morning was kind of when the phone stopped moving.
By the early morning hours of May 20th, all cell activity ends.
The cell phone died. We don't know if he was with the cell phone or whether someone else had the car and the cell phone just was in there.
Later that day, State Patrol finds Logan's car abandoned with his phone inside. Investigators still don't know if other people were with Logan the night he disappeared. For a week, his whereabouts remain a total mystery, until May 26th, when there's a startling development on social media.
The detective had been checking his phone and his computer. There was a hit on his Facebook account at the airport.
He might have checked into the Olympia Regional Airport, and so we thought maybe he might have fled.
Faced with the possibility of Logan at the airport, his family wonders if he may have had a specific destination in mind.
Logan learned about his father not too long before he disappeared.
That was when Logan's mother, Hannah, told him his dad lives in Saudi Arabia.
He never said anything about wanting to go meet his father or go find him or anything like that. But that doesn't mean he wasn't thinking it.
A week after 19-year-old Logan Schindelman disappeared, a provocative lead surfaces on social media. Detectives discover that Logan may have checked in on Facebook from the airport only a few miles from his home. According to his family, he may have been seeking out his estranged father who lives in Saudi Arabia. But they question how that could be possible when his wallet was left in the car.
You have to have your driver's license, some form of ID to get out of the country. We had been talking about getting passports renewed because his needed to be renewed, but he never asked for it.
Which suggests he could have found another way.
If Logan left the country, he would not have left as Logan Schindelman. He would have left under another alias.
He might have wanted to change his identity. That's another thought I've had is, did he get a fake ID and is living someplace else doing something?
The family's theories hit a wall when the Facebook check-in from the airport turns out to have been misinterpreted.
It was a check-in, but it was one from a year prior, and it was just an anniversary thing that Facebook posted.
There's no other evidence that Logan tried to leave town, leaving investigators stumped and his family grasping at straws. Some wonder if Logan's disappearance could be tied to his increasing use of drugs.
Logan was smoking a lot of pot. He was getting a little bit paranoid sometimes. Sometimes he decided people were looking in his window, in his room. So he would lock his door.
Ginny wonders if Logan's drug use could have gotten him into trouble with local dealers.
I don't think he would have gone and tried to rip anybody off. It's not Logan at all. But he could have gotten mixed up with somebody that was selling drugs.
Logan's the type of person that I would never see doing anything worse than like smoking pot or drinking alcohol. He was never a drug abuser.
But if Logan didn't have problems with drugs, then Ginny wonders if the paranoia she witnessed may have been the precursor to a psychological break.
I've thought about him being on the verge of a mental breakdown somewhat, and that was the epiphany, took him off into some kind of strange direction. I know that that's when schizophrenia has a tendency to hit. And I think with young men more than women.
Ginny worries that his emotional and psychological struggles could have driven her grandson to harm himself.
You know, he'd been upset and maybe depressed, definitely thinking through who he was and what was going on in his life. I think people can do anything, especially if they're depressed or troubled. Especially at 19, you're not thinking long term. I don't want him to have done anything. If you commit suicide, somebody's going to find something at some point.
According to some of his relatives, Logan may have been troubled by his living situation at Ginny's.
I know that he was not happy being in the home, even before he went off to college. When he came back, he was even more unhappy.
When Logan came back from college, I spoke with him a couple times. And the first thing that Logan told me was, you know, my sister's boyfriend has moved in, don't you?
Logan's half-sister Chloe's boyfriend, Jake, and his 2 kids had taken up residence in the Schindelman home. According to Logan's great-aunt and uncle, Logan was not happy about living under the same roof as Jake and his children.
Mike and Mary thought that maybe Jake was trouble, and Jake does have some trouble past, some domestic violence issues, things of that nature.
Jake and Logan had some fights. I don't know if there was any foul play, but I do know that Jake is capable of some violence.
In 2013, Jake pleaded guilty to felony assault in a previous relationship. Logan's extended family is concerned that Jake's violent past could mean he did something to Logan. But according to Ginny, who lived with them both, the tension between Logan and Jake has been overstated by others in the family.
Sometimes they disagreed. I wouldn't call them particularly good friends, but it wasn't like people beating on each other or anything like that.
By October of 2016, Logan has been missing for 5 months when Jake lands in jail for violating his probation. Police take the opportunity to follow through on Great Uncle Mike and Great Aunt Mary's suspicions.
We did do a polygraph on him, and so I asked him, did he have anything to do with the disappearance of Logan? And I asked him if he knew who was responsible for Logan's disappearance, and he answered no, both of them. And in my opinion, I read him as being truthful to those questions.
But Logan's great uncle, a former deputy sheriff, disagrees.
I think by and large, polygraphs are reliable. I think they can be beaten.
Despite Logan's issues with Jake, investigators find no evidence that Jake had anything to do with his disappearance. And Jake has always maintained his innocence. Furthermore, authorities learn that there may have been other reasons why Logan wanted to vanish. According to his relatives, he may have been running from what he saw as a bitter conflict within the family.
Logan's grandmother never made the opportunity for him to meet or to associate with the African-American side of the family, relatives.
He wanted to know about this other family. I mean, he wanted the truth.
Logan Schindelman vanished from his hometown of Tumwater, Washington, back in May of 2016. After a series of mysterious, unresolved leads, police wonder if Logan may have run away from what he saw as a family dispute.
You know, it would have benefited Logan to know the African-American side of his family. It would give him a sense of identity.
Tina Crary's brother is Hannah's father and Logan's grandfather.
I don't think he knew about Tina or that other part of his family. I think he was totally shocked that they even existed.
According to Tina, Ginny cut ties to the African-American side of the family when, after her daughter Hannah was born, Ginny and Tina's brother broke up. Logan went most of his life without meeting his grandfather or his great-aunt Tina.
I think that, you know, for years it was just underneath the surface, you know, him not knowing his identity and not knowing his background. I think it was always there. And as he got older, he was able to ask more questions, and he was able to maybe connect the dots.
Right before Logan left for college, he met Tina for the first time when he was invited to her house for dinner.
We looked at lots of pictures. His eyes were just wide, and he was shaking his head. He just stared at it, and he looked up at me, and he said, "It feels so good to see someone that looks like me." As if he was saying, finally, there's someone that looks like me. I finally found them.
According to Tina, Logan thought his grandmother Jenny might be upset by this meeting, so he kept it a secret from her.
He said that she's going to be mad if she finds out. And I did tell him, I said, you know something, you're a grown man. You can come here anytime you want.
But Ginny says Logan didn't keep the meeting from her at all, and even confided in her about it.
He said, why is Tina complaining about you all the time? You know, she's complaining about the one person who's been with us, taken care of us for our entire lives. I don't get it.
Ginny says Tina's family only tried very briefly to have a relationship with Logan while he was growing up.
You know, for probably 6 months, maybe, once or twice, they tried to get a hold of me. That was about it. And then after that, no, wasn't any effort. If Logan wanted to have a long-term relationship with him, why, that was fine with me too. I certainly wasn't going to tell him no.
Although Tina and Logan didn't meet again, they kept in contact through social media after he went to college.
He mentioned, you know, that his classes were going to be starting in like another week. So it was brand new and fresh. He was excited about that. He wasn't quite sure what he wanted as a major. I said, that's okay. You can decide later on. Just go to school.
Tina continued to follow Logan's posts even after he left college, and noticed he was still exploring his identity.
And then I started seeing quotes from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. One in particular that he really liked was, if you want to be heard in this world, you better make some noise. And I really think that Logan was trying to be heard, but he wasn't quite sure how to do it.
Tina believes Logan may have chosen to leave in order to take control of his own life.
I'm hoping that he thought, I have to get away from here. I have to get away from everybody. I think Logan realized maybe this is his only chance.
You know, you have two different stories. It kind of seemed like some of the dynamics that were going on there would lead you to believe that maybe Logan did want to leave. And again, that's one of the theories that we have, is that maybe he's just out there and he wants to be left alone.
I have no idea what was on his mind. None of us do. Besides, you know, what we're hearing from the family, the two of the sides fighting. The perspective that is missing is Logan's.
The question of whether Logan walked away from his life becomes just another facet of a profound mystery. In June of 2017, 13 months after Logan went missing, a new lead surfaces when a woman calls police after seeing media coverage of his disappearance. She says she saw Logan's car on the freeway the day he went missing. Inexplicably, her account differs from the eyewitness who reported seeing just one person near Logan's car.
She remembered the vehicle sitting there on the shoulder. Now she sees that there's a black male standing at the rear of the vehicle, and then she sees two white males.
The eyewitness describes one man as tall, with scraggly, bowl-cut hair, and wearing tight clothing. All she could see of the second man was that he had long blonde hair. Based on a follow-up interview, a police sketch artist generates this portrait of the unidentified blonde man.
We put out on the social media and media outlets as well. Since the sketch has gone out, we've had some people say it looks like this person, looks like that person. And so when I look at them, I'm trying to see if they have some kind of criminal activity or some kind of criminal history, and then try to see if there's some kind of link that would put them in the area.
But the man in the sketch remains a complete mystery. To date, no new leads have surfaced.
At this point, with like how long the investigation's been going and how many investigators have been on it and how deeply they've looked into it, there's nothing really more to like look for. It's just really a matter of waiting for something to come out.
Mike and Mary Ware keep hope alive with their own search efforts.
We've had people call us from California, Oregon, Canada that have found Logan rocks while they have been hiking. These are the rocks that have been painted by volunteers with Logan's information on the back of them. So if someone finds a rock, the rock explains that they can go to Facebook and get all the information about Logan's disappearance.
If Logan is still out there, both sides of his family say the same thing, that they miss him terribly and want him home safe.
If he would have walked in tomorrow, he'd be accepted.
There are no questions asked, no judgment. If he wants to come back, he's got a place to go.
Investigators are left puzzling over a case where nothing adds up, while Logan's family and friends suffer the agony of not knowing what happened to the young man who brought so much light.
There are murders that announce themselves. A broken window, a door kicked from its hinges, furniture overturned, blood across the floor, neighbors awakened by screams. A crime scene so violent that no one could mistake what had happened. And then there are murders that leave almost nothing behind. No shattered glass. No overturned furniture. No desperate struggle visible to the naked eye. Just a bedroom. A bed. And a woman who appears to have died quietly in her sleep. In the early 1970s, in the cities of London and Guelph, Ontario, that distinction would become terrifyingly important. Because somewhere in those quiet neighborhoods, someone had discovered a way to enter a woman's home without waking her. He did not need to smash through a door. He did not need to force a window. He could wait. He could watch. He could learn her routine. And when the lights went out, when the streets became quiet, when the woman inside her apartment believed herself to be completely alone, he could climb. Up the side of a building. Across a balcony. Toward a door that was never supposed to be opened from the outside. And on the other side of that door, someone would be sleeping. For the women who crossed his path, home was no longer a sanctuary. The bedroom was no longer the safest room in the apartment. The darkness outside the window was no longer empty. Someone could be standing there, watching, waiting. And the most disturbing part was that, for years, almost nobody understood what was happening. A young woman could go to bed at night believing she had nothing to fear. By morning, she could be dead. Her body could be lying neatly beneath the sheets. The room could appear almost untouched. There might be no obvious sign that another person had ever been there. And investigators, faced with such a scene, had to begin with the most ordinary explanation. Maybe she had died naturally. Maybe it was a medical problem. Maybe medication had interacted with something else in her body. Maybe an illness had taken her during the night. There was nothing dramatic about the room. Nothing that immediately demanded the word murder. And so the dead were sometimes buried before anyone realized that a killer had been standing among them. This was the world in which Russell Maurice Johnson operated. A man who, according to later confessions and investigations, would become connected to the deaths of 7 women. 7 lives. 7 families. 7 bedrooms that would eventually become pieces of a much larger and darker picture. But at the beginning, there was no serial killer. There was only a dead woman. Then another. Then another. Separate tragedies. Separate addresses. Separate explanations. The pattern was there. But nobody could see it. Not yet. The first known death associated with Johnson occurred in the fall of 1973. The victim was 20-year-old Mary Catherine Hicks, a student in London, Ontario. 20 years old. An age when life is supposed to feel as though it is opening outward. There should have been plans. Classes. Friends. Conversations that stretched late into the night. Ordinary worries that seemed important at the time and ordinary dreams that had not yet been tested by life. But one day, Mary Catherine Hicks was found dead in her bedroom. There was no chaotic scene waiting for investigators. Her body was lying on the bed. The room did not immediately tell a story of violence. There was no obvious struggle that screamed for attention. Instead, the circumstances suggested something much quieter. A medical explanation. a possible interaction involving prescription medication. And that explanation was enough. For the moment, a young woman had died, and the world moved forward without understanding that her death might have been the opening chapter of something much larger. Later that same year, another woman named Alice Ralston died in Guelph. She was 42. Again, there was no obvious scene of terror. No room transformed into a battlefield. No immediate evidence that a stranger had entered during the night. Her death was attributed to a natural medical condition, including arteriosclerosis. Another woman gone. Another explanation. Another file that could be closed. And somewhere in Ontario, a man was still free. If investigators had placed those two deaths side by side, perhaps the differences would have seemed more important than the similarities. Different women. Different ages. Different locations. Different circumstances. But the killer did not need the women to look alike. He needed them to be vulnerable. He needed privacy. He needed time. And he understood something that investigators would only fully appreciate years later. A person can be murdered without leaving behind the kind of chaos people expect murder to create. In fact, the quieter the scene, the easier it can be to believe the wrong story. In 1974, another woman, 27-year-old Eleanor Hartwick, was found dead. Again, the bedroom seemed almost deceptively peaceful. She appeared to have died while sleeping. The kind of death that leaves behind grief, but not immediate suspicion. For her family, there was no obvious villain to hate. There was no stranger's face. No threatening message. No witness who could point toward a particular man and say, "I saw him." There was simply the unbearable fact that someone they loved had gone to bed and never truly left it. And then came Doris Brown, 49 years old, living in a second-floor apartment in Guelph. On the night of August 8th into August 9th, 1974, her life came to an end. By morning, her daughter Laura would discover her. Doris was lying on her bed. Once again, the scene did not immediately resemble the work of a serial killer. There was no obvious spectacle. No dramatic trail leading from the apartment. No stranger waiting outside to be identified. Her death was initially regarded as natural and unexplained. For women. For deaths. And still, no serial murder investigation. That is one of the darkest elements of this story. Not that a killer was moving through Ontario, but that the world around him continued to function normally. Cars drove down the streets. People went to work. Students walked to class. Neighbors exchanged greetings. Families made dinner. Couples made plans for the weekend. People locked their doors at night and assumed that the walls around them offered protection. And somewhere in that ordinary world was a man who had begun learning how to enter those protected spaces. He did not need to attack women in dark alleys. He did not need to chase them through empty streets. He could come to them. He could study the architecture of their homes. He could watch the balconies. He could look for weaknesses. And according to later accounts, he could climb. Imagine living several stories above the ground. Imagine closing your curtains at night. Imagine looking through the glass doors leading to your balcony and seeing nothing but darkness. A normal person sees an empty balcony. A killer may see an entrance. That difference is almost impossible to understand until it is too late. Then, on December 30th, 1974, 23-year-old Diane Beets had every reason to believe that her life was moving towards something beautiful. She had a future. She had someone she loved. Her boyfriend, James Britton, had proposed to her. An engagement ring had become part of her life. The two were planning to marry in May. For Diane, the future had a date. A month. A ceremony. Perhaps a dress. Perhaps a home. Perhaps children. Perhaps all the small, ordinary details that people imagine when they realize that the person beside them might be the person they will spend the rest of their life with. But the future can disappear with terrifying speed. On the morning of December 31st, Britton left Diane's apartment and went to work. She was still there when he left. The apartment was still a place where life existed. Clothes. Plans. Personal belongings. The quiet evidence of an ordinary young woman preparing for another day. But when Britton returned that evening, something felt wrong. Clothing was still soaking in the bathtub. It was an insignificant detail. The kind of thing that normally means nothing. A load of laundry. Something started and left unfinished. But now it would become part of a scene that no one could forget. Britton moved through the apartment, and eventually he reached the bedroom. Diane was dead. She had been killed in the room where she should have been safest. Her hands had been tied behind her back. A bra and pantyhose had been used around her neck. Investigators determined that she had also been sexually assaulted after her death. The illusion of a peaceful death was gone. This was murder. And for the first time, the possibility emerged that the earlier deaths might not have been what they appeared to be. Someone had entered Diane's world. Someone had approached her while she was vulnerable. Someone had transformed an ordinary bedroom into the final place she would ever see. The questions began. Who had watched her? Who knew she was there? Who knew her routine? How had the killer entered? How long had he been inside? Had Diane known him? Had she opened the door voluntarily? Or had he found another way in? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, was this the first time? Investigators in Guelph began looking for answers. A reward of $5,000 was offered for information. Witnesses were questioned. Details were examined. A dark-colored four-door Buick had reportedly been seen behind the building. It was one small fragment in a case that was beginning to expand. But a fragment is not a picture. And the man investigators were looking for remained outside their reach. The killer had made a terrible calculation. He understood that murder attracts attention, but a mysterious death can disappear into uncertainty. He had already benefited from that uncertainty, for women had died before Diane, and the possibility existed that they had all been killed by the same person. But suspicion alone could not bring back the dead. It could not tell investigators where to look. It could not place a face on the killer. And it certainly could not warn every woman in London and Guelph that someone might be watching from outside her bedroom. For the killer, the darkness was an ally. For everyone else, it was simply night. And night came every evening. The investigation would continue. The women of those cities would continue going home. Doors would be locked. Curtains would be drawn. Lights would be switched off. And bedrooms would fall silent. But one bedroom was never truly empty. Not anymore. Because somewhere beyond the walls, someone was learning. Learning which apartments were occupied. Learning who lived alone. Learning which balconies were accessible. Learning when people went to work. Learning when they returned. Learning when they slept. This was not random violence. It was patience. And patience is what made the threat so difficult to see. A violent stranger might be stopped by a locked door. A patient predator might simply wait for the moment that door was left open, or find another way around it. Years later, after Johnson had finally been caught, investigators would begin connecting pieces that had once seemed unrelated. They would hear confessions. They would revisit old deaths. They would look again at women whose families had been told that their loved ones had died from natural causes or unexplained medical problems. And suddenly, the past would look different. A bedroom that once appeared peaceful could become a crime scene. A death certificate could become a question. An old investigation could become the beginning of a murder case. And a man who had once walked freely through the streets could become the central figure in one of Ontario's most disturbing criminal investigations of the decade. But that reckoning was still years away. In 1974, Russell Maurice Johnson was not yet the man whose name would be associated with the words bedroom strangler. He was simply a man moving through ordinary life. A man who could be seen in public. A man who could speak to people. A man who could appear completely unremarkable. That is what makes stories like this so difficult to comprehend. We want evil to have a recognizable face. We want the dangerous person to look dangerous. We want something in his expression to warn us. Something in his clothes. Something in his voice. Something that allows us to separate him from everyone else. But people do not always come with warnings. Sometimes the most frightening person in the story is not the man standing in the shadows. It is the man who can step out of the shadows and look perfectly ordinary. Johnson would eventually be captured. He would eventually confess. He would eventually face a courtroom. And the investigation would eventually reveal a pattern stretching back years. But before the confessions, before the courtroom, before the psychiatric evaluations and the arguments over responsibility, there were women whose stories had not yet been connected. There was Mary Catherine Hicks, Alice Ralston, Eleanor Hartwick, Doris Brown, Diane Beats. 5 women whose deaths, viewed separately, could be explained. Viewed together, they began to form something else. A pattern. A shadow. A presence that had been moving quietly through Ontario. And the story was not finished. In fact, the most terrifying part had not yet happened. Because after Diane Beets was found dead, the killer did not disappear forever. He simply became quieter. For a time, the trail went cold. The city breathed again. People went back to their routines. The years passed, and perhaps some believed that whatever had happened was over. But 4 years later, in 1977, another young woman would die. Her name was Luella Jean George. She was 23. She lived in London. And according to the later account of the case, the man who came for her did not force his way through the front door. He climbed, for stories, up toward a balcony, toward a woman who had no reason to believe that anyone could reach her there. When Luella was killed, investigators would find a connection that was almost impossible to ignore. Jewelry and underwear belonging to her were discovered in a garbage container between her apartment and the place where Russell Johnson lived. The distance between the killer and his victim was no longer theoretical. It was physical. It could be measured. He had not simply wandered into a city and disappeared. He had been living among the people he was watching. And then came July 16, 1977. Donna Veldboom was 22. She lived directly above Johnson's apartment. The woman upstairs. The man downstairs. A distance of only 1 floor separating an ordinary life from a predator who had already killed before. This time, the investigation would move faster. This time, the evidence would begin closing around him. This time, the man who had spent years relying on darkness would make a mistake. And once investigators finally reached Russell Maurice Johnson, they would discover something that would change the meaning of the earlier deaths. The man they had arrested would not speak only about Donna Veldboom. He would not speak only about Luella George. He would begin talking about other women. Women whose deaths had already been recorded. Women whose families had already mourned them. Women whose deaths had been explained as accidents, illness, or natural causes. 7 women in all would ultimately be associated with his crimes. 7 lives reduced to 7 endings. But the number 7 does not tell us who they were. It does not tell us what they loved. It does not tell us what they feared. It does not tell us who was waiting for them at home. It does not tell us about the plans they made for the following week. It does not tell us about the people who expected to hear their voices again. And it certainly does not tell us what it means for a family to learn, years after a loved one's death, that the person they had believed died naturally may have actually been murdered. That is where this story truly begins. Not with Russell Johnson. Not with the courtroom. Not even with the moment of his arrest. It begins with the women. With the bedrooms that became crime scenes. With the families who were left behind. With the unanswered questions. And with a terrifying realization that would emerge only after years of silence. Sometimes the most dangerous place is not the dark street outside your home. Sometimes the danger is already standing on the other side of the bedroom window, waiting for you to fall asleep. For years, the women were remembered separately. That was the tragedy. Each family carried its own version of the story. One family remembered a young woman whose life had ended far too soon. Another remembered a mother who had gone to bed and never awakened. Another remembered a daughter whose death had seemed inexplicable, but not criminal. There was no single memorial for them. No single investigation. No wall covered with photographs. No detective standing before a map, drawing red lines between addresses. Not yet. Instead, there were individual rooms scattered across Ontario. Individual beds. Individual lives. And in each of those rooms, someone had died. The difference between what people believed had happened and what had actually happened would eventually become one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Because death does not always announce the presence of a murderer. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it leaves a room almost exactly as it found it. A glass remains on a table. A book stays open. A coat hangs beside the door. Clothes wait to be picked up. A bed remains made. And the person who should be there tomorrow is simply not going to be there. For the families, there is a terrible finality to that silence. But there is another kind of pain when the truth comes years later. Imagine believing that someone you loved died because of illness. Imagine accepting that explanation because there is nothing else to hold on to. You grieve. You ask questions. Eventually, you begin to live with the absence. The empty chair becomes part of the house. The photograph becomes part of the room. The birthday becomes another difficult date on the calendar. Years pass. And then someone comes to you and tells you that your loved one may not have died naturally. Someone may have entered her home. Someone may have watched her. Someone may have stood beside her while she slept. Someone may have taken her life. And suddenly grief changes shape. The past becomes frightening. Every memory acquires a shadow. Every unanswered question becomes heavier. Why did nobody know? Why did nobody see anything? Why did the investigation stop? Why did we believe the first explanation? And most painfully, who was responsible? Those questions would eventually surround the case of Russell Maurice Johnson. But in the beginning, there was no reason for anyone to imagine that a serial killer was moving through their community. The cities themselves did not look like places where such a thing should happen. London and Guelph were not imagined as hunting grounds. They were communities. Places where people built ordinary lives. Places where neighbors knew one another. Places where young people went to school, found jobs, dated, married, rented apartments, and planned their futures. The kind of places where people believed danger belonged somewhere else. Perhaps in another city. Perhaps in another neighborhood. Perhaps in the stories people read about in newspapers. But not here. Not behind their own windows. Not in their own bedrooms. That belief would become one of the killer's greatest advantages. Because fear is easiest to exploit when people have no reason to feel it. A locked door provides comfort. A second-floor apartment provides comfort. A balcony several stories above the street provides comfort. Darkness outside the window provides comfort when you believe no one can reach you. But Russell Johnson understood something that many people did not. Height does not always equal safety. Distance does not always equal protection. And a home is only as secure as the person who is trying to get inside. The details of Johnson's movements would later reveal a man who was willing to observe before he acted. That distinction matters. A sudden attack is often chaotic. There is adrenaline. There is noise. There are mistakes. But someone who watches first can learn. He can learn which lights turn off first. He can learn who leaves for work in the morning. He can learn who comes home late. He can learn whether someone lives alone. He can learn whether a balcony door is locked. He can learn whether neighbors pay attention. He can learn the architecture of a building. And the longer he watches, the less he has to rely on chance. That is what makes stalking so terrifying. The victim does not know there is a story happening around her. She is simply living. She may stop for groceries. She may speak with a friend. She may laugh with someone on the telephone. She may stand in front of a mirror before going out. She may come home tired. She may close the curtains. She may check the lock. And somewhere nearby, a stranger may already know more about her routine than she realizes. That invisible imbalance is where the fear begins. One person knows. The other does not. One person is preparing. The other is simply living. And in the case of Russell Johnson, that imbalance would eventually become deadly. But there was another element that made his crimes so difficult to understand. He did not necessarily need to leave the kind of evidence investigators expected. He was not creating spectacular crime scenes. He was not leaving behind a signature that immediately announced the presence of the same offender. Instead, there were bedrooms, quiet rooms, bodies, and uncertainty. In the early cases, that uncertainty was enough. A young woman dies. Doctors consider medical causes. A middle-aged woman dies. Investigators see no immediate evidence of homicide. Another woman is found dead. Again, there is no obvious struggle. The explanations may have differed, but the conclusion was similar. There was no killer to find. And if there was no killer, there was no reason to search for one. This is how a predator can hide in plain sight. Not necessarily by being invisible, but by allowing everyone else to see the wrong thing. The wrong explanation can be more powerful than no explanation at all. It closes a case. It gives a family something they can understand. It gives investigators a direction. It gives the community permission to move on. And while everyone moves on, the person responsible remains free. That freedom matters. Because a killer who is not suspected does not have to behave like a fugitive. He can go to work. He can shop. He can speak to neighbors. He can walk through a public building. He can sit in a room filled with other people. He can look completely ordinary. That ordinary appearance creates one of the central questions of this case. What does a killer look like before anyone knows he is a killer? The answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes he looks like everyone else. Russell Maurice Johnson was born in 1947. Before his name became associated with murder, there was nothing about his identity that could have warned an entire city. He was not introduced into the world as a monster. He grew up. He became an adult. He existed within society. And according to records concerning his later psychiatric history, there were signs of serious sexual disturbance before the murders began. In 1969, Johnson voluntarily entered London's psychiatric hospital. That detail would become important later. But at the time, it did not predict the future in a way anyone could fully understand. A man can have disturbing thoughts without committing murder. A person can struggle with impulses without becoming a killer. A psychiatric diagnosis does not automatically tell us what someone will do. That distinction matters because the story of Johnson cannot simply be reduced to the idea that he was evil from the beginning. The more disturbing reality is that his behavior developed within a complicated psychological landscape. There were fantasies. There were compulsions. There were sexual disturbances. And eventually there were actions. The distance between those things is where the story becomes difficult. Because people often want a simple explanation. They want a moment when the monster was created. A single event. A single diagnosis. A single childhood trauma. A single sentence that can explain everything. Real lives rarely offer such convenience. What we can see in Johnson's story is something far more troubling. A progression. A movement from thoughts toward behavior. From observation toward intrusion. From intrusion toward violence. And once that boundary was crossed, the consequences became irreversible. The first known deaths associated with him occurred in 1973. By then, he was an adult man living within a society that had no reason to connect him with those women. There was no public face attached to the deaths. No name printed beside the word serial killer. No warning posters telling women to be careful around a particular man. There was only uncertainty. And uncertainty creates time. Time creates opportunity. Opportunity gives a predator room to learn. By the time Diane Beats was murdered in December 1974, the nature of the violence was becoming harder to dismiss. Her death was not simply another unexplained passing. She had been restrained. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been killed inside her own home. Now there was a crime. Now there was a killer. And investigators had to confront the possibility that this killer had been active before Diane. But even then, the full pattern remained hidden. Imagine looking at 5 separate points on a map without knowing they belong to the same shape. Point 1 is a tragedy. Point 2 is another tragedy. Point 3 is another. You can record each one. You can investigate each one. You can close each file. But unless someone steps back and sees the entire map, the pattern remains invisible. That is what happened here. The pattern was not absent. It was simply fragmented. And the person responsible benefited from every fragment. The first 4 women were separated by their names, ages, circumstances, and locations. Diane was separated from them by the obvious violence of her death. Later victims would create new links. But years would pass before those connections became impossible to ignore. And during those years, the women of Ontario continued living. They continued sleeping. They continued trusting the walls around them. They continued believing that if they were inside their own homes, they were safe. That belief is one of the most heartbreaking elements of the story. Because home is supposed to be where vigilance ends. Outside, you watch your surroundings. Inside, you breathe. You remove your shoes. You change clothes. You close the curtains. You climb into bed. You allow yourself to become vulnerable. Sleep is an act of trust. You close your eyes because you believe nothing is going to happen while you are unconscious. You believe the locked door will remain locked. You believe the person outside cannot reach you. You believe the night will pass. For some of Johnson's victims, that trust was betrayed in the most intimate place imaginable. Their bedrooms. The place where photographs might have hung. Where clothes were folded. Where letters were kept. Where personal objects told the story of a life. And eventually, where that life ended. There is something especially disturbing about a crime committed in a bedroom, because a bedroom is not public. It is private. It is personal. It is where people are most exposed. And after a murder, the room remains. The walls remain. The bed remains. The objects remain. But the person does not. Families may enter that room afterward and see everything exactly as it was left. A pair of shoes. A comb. A book. A photograph. A piece of clothing. Each object becomes a reminder that someone was there only hours earlier. And then suddenly they were gone. For families of the early victims, there was another layer of tragedy. They did not necessarily know they were grieving a murder victim. They were grieving someone whose death had been given another explanation. That meant the killer was not only taking lives. He was also taking the truth. He was leaving families with incomplete stories. And incomplete stories can haunt people for decades. The truth would eventually return. But it would not return gently. It would come through the confession of the man responsible. It would force investigators to reopen the past. It would force families to reconsider what they thought they knew. It would force the public to look again at deaths that had once seemed unrelated. And it would reveal that the killer had been closer than anyone imagined. He had not been operating from some distant place. He was living within the same world as his victims. The same streets. The same buildings. The same stores. The same city. The same nights. That is why the case became more than a story about one man. It became a story about vulnerability, about assumptions, about the limits of what investigators can see when the evidence appears ordinary, and about how a killer can exploit the difference between what happened and what people believe happened. For years, that difference protected Russell Johnson, until it didn't. The final months of the story would bring everything crashing together. Luella Jean George. Donna Wildboom. The apartment. The balcony. The objects connected to a victim found near Johnson's own residence. The investigation closing around him. The arrest. And then the confessions. But before any of that, there was a long silence. A silence measured not in minutes, but in years. For women were already dead. Diane Beats had been murdered. The killer was still free. And nobody yet knew how many lives were connected to the same man. That uncertainty is what makes the opening of this case so disturbing. Because when investigators finally understood the pattern, they were not looking at the beginning of a crime spree. They were looking backward. They were looking into rooms where people had already stood. They were reopening deaths that had already been mourned. They were asking questions of families who had already been told the story was over. And they were discovering that the story had never been over. The killer had simply been waiting. Waiting for another opportunity. Waiting for another woman to come home. Waiting for another night. And in 1977, he would find one. Then another. The years of uncertainty would begin to collapse. The man who had relied on darkness would begin leaving traces. The predator who had once controlled the distance between himself and his victims would make the fatal mistake of moving too close. And when the police finally placed Russell Maurice Johnson under arrest, they believed they were catching a man connected to 3 murders. They did not yet know that they were opening the door to something much larger. Because once Johnson began to talk, the dead would begin to speak through him. Names would emerge. Old addresses. Old bedrooms. Old explanations. And one by one, the deaths that had once seemed separate would begin to form a single horrifying narrative. 7 women. 7 lives. 1 killer. And a question that would remain long after the courtroom fell silent. How many times can a person look at death and fail to recognize murder? The answer in this case was devastating. More than once. And perhaps that is where the true horror of Russell Maurice Johnson begins. Not with the moment he killed, but with the fact that, for years afterward, the world did not know that a killer had done it. The women went to sleep. Their families trusted the explanations. The cities continued moving. And Russell Johnson remained free. Until one night, the pattern finally broke. Until one victim lived above him. Until evidence began appearing where it could no longer be ignored. Until investigators followed the trail back to the man who had been hiding behind ordinary life. And until the quiet bedrooms of Ontario finally became connected by one name. Russell Maurice Johnson. The bedroom strangler. The balcony killer. A man who had discovered that the safest-looking room in a home could become the most dangerous place in the world. And by the time anyone understood what he had been doing, the lives of 7 women had already been taken. But those 7 women were never simply numbers. They had names. They had families. They had futures. And before this story can ever be about the man who killed them, it must first remember who they were. For years, the women were remembered separately. That was the tragedy. Each family carried its own version of the story. One family remembered a young woman whose life had ended far too soon. Another remembered a mother who had gone to bed and never awakened. Another remembered a daughter whose death had seemed inexplicable, but not criminal. There was no single memorial for them. No single investigation. No wall covered with photographs. No detective standing before a map, drawing red lines between addresses. Not yet. Instead, there were individual rooms scattered across Ontario. Individual beds. Individual lives. And in each of those rooms, someone had died. The difference between what people believed had happened and what had actually happened would eventually become one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Because death does not always announce the presence of a murderer. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it leaves a room almost exactly as it found it. A glass remains on a table. A book stays open. A coat hangs beside the door. Clothes wait to be picked up. A bed remains made. And the person who should be there tomorrow is simply not going to be there. For the families, there is a terrible finality to that silence. But there is another kind of pain when the truth comes years later. Imagine believing that someone you loved died because of illness. Imagine accepting that explanation because there is nothing else to hold on to. You grieve. You ask questions. Eventually, you begin to live with the absence. The empty chair becomes part of the house. The photograph becomes part of the room. The birthday becomes another difficult date on the calendar. Years pass. And then someone comes to you and tells you that your loved one may not have died naturally. Someone may have entered her home. Someone may have watched her. Someone may have stood beside her while she slept. Someone may have taken her life. And suddenly grief changes shape. The past becomes frightening. Every memory acquires a shadow. Every unanswered question becomes heavier. Why did nobody know? Why did nobody see anything? Why did the investigation stop? Why did we believe the first explanation? And most painfully, who was responsible? Those questions would eventually surround the case of Russell Maurice Johnson. But in the beginning, there was no reason for anyone to imagine that a serial killer was moving through their community. The cities themselves did not look like places where such a thing should happen. London and Guelph were not imagined as hunting grounds. They were communities. Places where people built ordinary lives. Places where neighbors knew one another. Places where young people went to school, found jobs, dated, married, rented apartments, and planned their futures. The kind of places where people believed danger belonged somewhere else. Perhaps in another city. Perhaps in another neighborhood. Perhaps in the stories people read about in newspapers. But not here. Not behind their own windows. Not in their own bedrooms. That belief would become one of the killer's greatest advantages. Because fear is easiest to exploit when people have no reason to feel it. A locked door provides comfort. A second-floor apartment provides comfort. A balcony several stories above the street provides comfort. Darkness outside the window provides comfort when you believe no one can reach you. But Russell Johnson understood something that many people did not. Height does not always equal safety. Distance does not always equal protection. And a home is only as secure as the person who is trying to get inside. The details of Johnson's movements would later reveal a man who was willing to observe before he acted. That distinction matters. A sudden attack is often chaotic. There is adrenaline. There is noise. There are mistakes. But someone who watches first can learn. He can learn which lights turn off first. He can learn who leaves for work in the morning. He can learn who comes home late. He can learn whether someone lives alone. He can learn whether a balcony door is locked. He can learn whether neighbors pay attention. He can learn the architecture of a building. And the longer he watches, the less he has to rely on chance. That is what makes stalking so terrifying. The victim does not know there is a story happening around her. She is simply living. She may stop for groceries. She may speak with a friend. She may laugh with someone on the telephone. She may stand in front of a mirror before going out. She may come home tired. She may close the curtains. She may check the lock. And somewhere nearby, a stranger may already know more about her routine than she realizes. That invisible imbalance is where the fear begins. One person knows. The other does not. One person is preparing. The other is simply living. And in the case of Russell Johnson, that imbalance would eventually become deadly. But there was another element that made his crimes so difficult to understand. He did not necessarily need to leave the kind of evidence investigators expected. He was not creating spectacular crime scenes. He was not leaving behind a signature that immediately announced the presence of the same offender. Instead, there were bedrooms, quiet rooms, bodies, and uncertainty. In the early cases, that uncertainty was enough. A young woman dies. Doctors consider medical causes. A middle-aged woman dies. Investigators see no immediate evidence of homicide. Another woman is found dead. Again, there is no obvious struggle. The explanations may have differed, but the conclusion was similar. There was no killer to find. And if there was no killer, there was no reason to search for one. This is how a predator can hide in plain sight. Not necessarily by being invisible, but by allowing everyone else to see the wrong thing. The wrong explanation can be more powerful than no explanation at all. It closes a case. It gives a family something they can understand. It gives investigators a direction. It gives the community permission to move on. And while everyone moves on, the person responsible remains free. That freedom matters. Because a killer who is not suspected does not have to behave like a fugitive. He can go to work. He can shop. He can speak to neighbors. He can walk through a public building. He can sit in a room filled with other people. He can look completely ordinary. That ordinary appearance creates one of the central questions of this case. What does a killer look like before anyone knows he is a killer? The answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes he looks like everyone else. Russell Maurice Johnson was born in 1947. Before his name became associated with murder, there was nothing about his identity that could have warned an entire city. He was not introduced into the world as a monster. He grew up. He became an adult. He existed within society. And according to records concerning his later psychiatric history, there were signs of serious sexual disturbance before the murders began. In 1969, Johnson voluntarily entered London's psychiatric hospital. That detail would become important later. But at the time, it did not predict the future in a way anyone could fully understand. A man can have disturbing thoughts without committing murder. A person can struggle with impulses without becoming a killer. A psychiatric diagnosis does not automatically tell us what someone will do. That distinction matters because the story of Johnson cannot simply be reduced to the idea that he was evil from the beginning. The more disturbing reality is that his behavior developed within a complicated psychological landscape. There were fantasies. There were compulsions. There were sexual disturbances. And eventually there were actions. The distance between those things is where the story becomes difficult. Because people often want a simple explanation. They want a moment when the monster was created. A single event. A single diagnosis. A single childhood trauma. A single sentence that can explain everything. Real lives rarely offer such convenience. What we can see in Johnson's story is something far more troubling. A progression. A movement from thoughts toward behavior. From observation toward intrusion. From intrusion toward violence. And once that boundary was crossed, the consequences became irreversible. The first known deaths associated with him occurred in 1973. By then, he was an adult man living within a society that had no reason to connect him with those women. There was no public face attached to the deaths. No name printed beside the word serial killer. No warning posters telling women to be careful around a particular man. There was only uncertainty. And uncertainty creates time. Time creates opportunity. Opportunity gives a predator room to learn. By the time Diane Beats was murdered in December 1974, the nature of the violence was becoming harder to dismiss. Her death was not simply another unexplained passing. She had been restrained. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been killed inside her own home. Now there was a crime. Now there was a killer. And investigators had to confront the possibility that this killer had been active before Diane. But even then, the full pattern remained hidden. Imagine looking at 5 separate points on a map without knowing they belong to the same shape. Point 1 is a tragedy. Point 2 is another tragedy. Point 3 is another. You can record each one. You can investigate each one. You can close each file. But unless someone steps back and sees the entire map, the pattern remains invisible. That is what happened here. The pattern was not absent. It was simply fragmented. And the person responsible benefited from every fragment. The first 4 women were separated by their names, ages, circumstances, and locations. Diane was separated from them by the obvious violence of her death. Later victims would create new links. But years would pass before those connections became impossible to ignore. And during those years, the women of Ontario continued living. They continued sleeping. They continued trusting the walls around them. They continued believing that if they were inside their own homes, they were safe. That belief is one of the most heartbreaking elements of the story. Because home is supposed to be where vigilance ends. Outside, you watch your surroundings. Inside, you breathe. You remove your shoes. You change clothes. You close the curtains. You climb into bed. You allow yourself to become vulnerable. Sleep is an act of trust. You close your eyes because you believe nothing is going to happen while you are unconscious. You believe the locked door will remain locked. You believe the person outside cannot reach you. You believe the night will pass. For some of Johnson's victims, that trust was betrayed in the most intimate place imaginable. Their bedrooms. The place where photographs might have hung, where clothes were folded, where letters were kept, where personal objects told the story of a life. And eventually, where that life ended. There is something especially disturbing about a crime committed in a bedroom, because a bedroom is not public. It is private. It is personal. It is where people are most exposed. And after a murder, the room remains. The walls remain. The bed remains. The objects remain. But the person does not. Families may enter that room afterward and see everything exactly as it was left. A pair of shoes. A comb. A book. A photograph. A piece of clothing. Each object becomes a reminder that someone was there only hours earlier. And then suddenly they were gone. For families of the early victims, there was another layer of tragedy. They did not necessarily know they were grieving a murder victim. They were grieving someone whose death had been given another explanation. That meant the killer was not only taking lives. He was also taking the truth. He was leaving families with incomplete stories. And incomplete stories can haunt people for decades. The truth would eventually return. But it would not return gently. It would come through the confession of the man responsible. It would force investigators to reopen the past. It would force families to reconsider what they thought they knew. It would force the public to look again at deaths that had once seemed unrelated. And it would reveal that the killer had been closer than anyone imagined. He had not been operating from some distant place. He was living within the same world as his victims. The same streets. The same buildings. The same stores. The same city. The same nights. That is why the case became more than a story about one man. It became a story about vulnerability. About assumptions. About the limits of what investigators can see when the evidence appears ordinary. And about how a killer can exploit the difference between what happened and what people believe happened. For years, that difference protected Russell Johnson. Until it didn't. The final months of the story would bring everything crashing together. Luella Jean George. Donna Wildboom. The apartment. The balcony. The objects connected to a victim found near Johnson's own residence. The investigation closing around him. The arrest. And then the confessions. But before any of that, there was a long silence. A silence measured not in minutes, but in years. For women were already dead. Diane Beats had been murdered. The killer was still free. And nobody yet knew how many lives were connected to the same man. That uncertainty is what makes the opening of this case so disturbing. Because when investigators finally understood the pattern, they were not looking at the beginning of a crime spree. They were looking backward. They were looking into rooms where people had already stood. They were reopening deaths that had already been mourned. They were asking questions of families who had already been told the story was over. And they were discovering that the story had never been over. The killer had simply been waiting. Waiting for another opportunity. Waiting for another woman to come home. Waiting for another night. And in 1977, he would find one. Then another. The years of uncertainty would begin to collapse. The man who had relied on darkness would begin leaving traces. The predator who had once controlled the distance between himself and his victims would make the fatal mistake of moving too close. And when the police finally placed Russell Maurice Johnson under arrest, they believed they were catching a man connected to 3 murders. They did not yet know that they were opening the door to something much larger. Because once Johnson began to talk, the dead would begin to speak through him. Names would emerge. Old addresses. Old bedrooms. Old explanations. And one by one, the deaths that had once seemed separate would begin to form a single horrifying narrative. 7 women. 7 lives. 1 killer. And a question that would remain long after the courtroom fell silent. How many times can a person look at death and fail to recognize murder? The answer, in this case, was devastating. More than once. And perhaps that is where the true horror of Russell Maurice Johnson begins. Not with the moment he killed, but with the fact that, for years afterward, the world did not know that a killer had done it. The women went to sleep. Their families trusted the explanations. The cities continued moving. And Russell Johnson remained free. Until one night, the pattern finally broke. Until one victim lived above him. Until evidence began appearing where it could no longer be ignored. Until investigators followed the trail back to the man who had been hiding behind ordinary life. And until the quiet bedrooms of Ontario finally became connected by one name. Russell Maurice Johnson. The bedroom strangler. The balcony killer. A man who had discovered that the safest-looking room in a home could become the most dangerous place in the world. And by the time anyone understood what he had been doing, the lives of 7 women had already been taken. But those 7 women were never simply numbers. They had names. They had families. They had futures. And before this story can ever be about the man who killed them, it must first remember who they were. Before a city becomes the setting of a crime story, it is simply a place where people live. In the morning, people leave their homes carrying coffee and newspapers. Cars pull away from apartment buildings. Students hurry toward classes. Workers unlock doors and begin another day. People complain about the weather, talk about money, make plans for the weekend, and worry about things that seem important at the time. Nobody wakes up expecting to become part of a murder investigation. Nobody looks at the building across the street and wonders whether a killer is studying its balconies. Nobody expects the quiet man walking past them to become the subject of newspaper headlines. In the early 1970s, London and Guelph, Ontario, were places where ordinary life could feel reassuringly predictable. They were communities built around routines. And routines are exactly what someone like Russell Maurice Johnson could learn to exploit. London was a growing city in southwestern Ontario, large enough to offer anonymity, but still intimate enough that neighborhoods could feel familiar. It was a city of residential streets, apartment buildings, schools, businesses, institutions, and people constantly moving between them. There were places where students lived close to campus. There were apartment buildings where young couples rented their first homes. There were older residential neighborhoods where families had lived for years. There were working-class areas, commercial districts, quiet streets, and buildings where strangers passed one another every day without learning each other's names. That last detail mattered. A city does not have to be enormous for a person to disappear inside it. All it takes is enough people. Enough buildings. Enough routines. Enough strangers. And London had all of them. Guelph, meanwhile, had a different atmosphere. It was smaller. Its streets could feel more personal. People were closer to one another geographically, and yet even a smaller city contains thousands of private lives. Apartments create their own kind of anonymity. A person can live directly above someone for years and never know what happens behind the other person's door. You can hear footsteps overhead without knowing whose feet they belong to. You can pass someone in the hallway without knowing where they are going. You can see a light turn on in a window every evening and never wonder who is standing behind the curtain. In a building, people can live almost on top of one another while remaining complete strangers. That paradox would become important in the story of Russell Johnson, because some of his victims lived in apartments, and apartments offered something the killer understood well: privacy. A person living in an apartment may have neighbors on every side, but those neighbors are not necessarily watching. They may be working, sleeping, watching television, talking on the telephone, eating dinner. living their own lives. A wall can separate two people by only a few feet, while making their worlds completely invisible to one another. The architecture of ordinary life can create blind spots. A hallway turns. A stairwell disappears into darkness. A balcony hangs above the street. A door closes. A curtain moves. And suddenly, whatever happens inside is private. In the 1970s, those private spaces were even more difficult for investigators to monitor than they are today. There were no smartphones quietly recording movement. No doorbell cameras. No network of private surveillance systems capturing every person who entered a building. No digital trail showing where a person's phone had traveled. No online databases connecting information within seconds. Evidence had to be seen, remembered, collected, recorded. And often it depended on human memory. A witness might remember seeing a car. But what color was it? Dark blue? Black? Green? A witness might remember a man. But what did he look like? Tall? Medium height? Broad shoulders? Dark hair? A mustache? How long had the witness actually seen him? 10 seconds? 5? 2. Memory is not a camera. It changes. Details fade. Faces become uncertain. And when a crime happens at night, those limitations become even greater. A person can look directly at a stranger and still be unable to describe him accurately later. That was the world in which investigators were trying to solve these crimes. But technology was only part of the problem. The greater problem was expectation. People did not expect someone to climb the side of an apartment building. They did not expect a stranger to enter through a balcony. They did not expect a person to stand outside a bedroom while someone slept. And when people do not expect something to happen, they often fail to prepare for it. The balcony is a perfect example. From inside an apartment, a balcony feels like part of the home. It is outside, but it belongs to the private space. You might step onto it in the morning. You might leave a chair there. You might open the sliding door to let in fresh air. You might stand there and look down at the street. The ground feels distant. The people below appear small. The height itself creates a sense of security. Most people assume that if they live several floors above the ground, strangers cannot simply walk into their home. But Johnson was not thinking like most people. For him, the vertical wall was not necessarily a barrier. It could be a route. And that meant the architecture of these buildings could become part of his method. The city had created thousands of private rooms. The killer only needed to find the ones he could reach. This is one of the reasons the case remains so unsettling. There was no need for the killer to control the entire city. He only needed to understand a few buildings, a few routines, a few people, a few moments when the world around them became quiet. And quiet was everywhere. The nighttime city is different from the daytime city. During the day, everything is exposed. Windows are open. Cars move constantly. People walk along sidewalks. Delivery arrive. Neighbors are outside. Children play. The city is awake. At night, the same streets become fragmented. One window glows. Another goes dark. A parking lot empties. A hallway becomes silent. The number of people outside decreases. And the spaces between people become larger. For most people, night is simply the time when work ends and sleep begins. For someone watching from the shadows, night can be an opportunity. It gives privacy. It gives distance. It gives time. And time was something Russell Johnson appeared willing to use. He did not need to rush. The behavior attributed to him suggests a man who could observe his targets and their surroundings. That meant the ordinary routines of his victims could become information. When did she leave? When did she return? Did she live alone? Who visited her? Which door did she use? Which windows remained open? Was there a balcony? Could it be reached? Was there another building nearby? Were there neighbors who might notice something? These are questions that a normal person would never think to ask. That is what makes stalking so disturbing. The victim is living a life. The stalker is building a map. She sees a home. He sees entrances. She sees a balcony. He sees access. She sees nighttime. He sees cover. She sees a bedroom. He sees vulnerability. The two people are living in completely different realities, even when they are only a few feet apart. And the victim may never know that the second reality exists. In London and Guelph, there were countless opportunities for such anonymity. Apartment buildings were filled with people who came and went according to different schedules. A student might return home at midnight. A worker might leave before sunrise. A young couple might spend the evening together. An older resident might go to bed early. The city did not move as one organism. It moved in thousands of individual rhythms. And a predator can hide inside those rhythms. He does not need to be everywhere. He only needs to be somewhere at the right time. This is why the early murders were so difficult to connect. The victims were not all part of one obvious social circle. They did not all belong to the same family. They were not all the same age. They did not all live in the same building. The connection was not visible on the surface. It existed in the behavior of the person who targeted them. But investigators could only work with what they knew. And what they knew was limited. A woman was dead. The scene appeared quiet. There was no obvious reason to believe a stranger had entered. The medical explanation might seem plausible. And when an explanation is plausible, people tend to stop searching for alternatives. That is not negligence by itself. It is how human reasoning works. We are constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. When something terrible happens, we want a reason. If the reason appears convincing, we accept it. The problem comes when the first explanation is wrong. Then every assumption built upon it becomes part of the problem. The early deaths associated with Johnson existed inside that uncertainty. And while the authorities were not yet looking for a serial killer, Johnson was living his life. His personal history, however, contained something that would later become impossible to ignore. In 1969, years before the murders, Johnson voluntarily entered London's psychiatric hospital. The details of his psychological history would eventually become central to the legal case against him and to the question of his mental state. But it is important to understand what that meant at the time. A man seeking psychiatric help is not automatically a future murderer. Mental illness does not create a simple equation between diagnosis and violence. Millions of people struggle with psychological problems and never harm anyone. What matters in Johnson's story is not simply that he had received psychiatric treatment. It is what investigators would later learn about the nature of his sexual disturbances, his fantasies, and the behavior that eventually followed. The warning signs were not a complete prediction of the future. They were pieces. And pieces only become a picture after someone knows what they are looking at. Before the murders, Johnson was simply one person within a much larger population. There was no public reason for strangers to know his name. There was no reason for women to recognize his face. There was no reason for police officers walking through London or Guelph to stop him. And that anonymity gave him something invaluable. Freedom. Freedom to move. Freedom to watch. Freedom to approach. Freedom to leave. Freedom to return home afterward as if nothing had happened. That last part is perhaps the hardest to imagine. A person can commit an unspeakable act and then walk back into ordinary life. The world does not immediately change around him. The street looks the same. The building looks the same. The sky looks the same. People still talk. Cars still pass. Someone might even smile at him. Nobody knows what he has done. That separation between private behavior and public appearance can be extraordinarily powerful. And it is not unique to murder. Human beings are capable of compartmentalizing their lives. They can behave one way in one environment and another way somewhere else. The public person and the private person can appear to be two different individuals. For Johnson, that division would eventually become devastating, because the man living an ordinary life was also becoming a man capable of extraordinary violence. The cities around him offered something else he needed. People did not know one another deeply. A neighbor might recognize a face, but not a name. A person might see someone entering a building without asking why. A man carrying a bag might attract no attention at all. Someone standing near a parked car might be forgotten minutes later. In a crowded world, invisibility does not require magic. It requires ordinary behavior. That is why the public image of a serial killer is often misleading. We imagine someone constantly acting suspiciously. But a successful offender understands that suspicious behavior attracts attention. Ordinary behavior does the opposite. It disappears. The most effective disguise is often not a mask. It is normality. And Johnson had years to live inside that disguise. The murders did not begin with the public knowing there was a predator. They began with individual victims. And each victim lived inside a world that continued after her death. That world matters. Because when we talk about a serial killer, there is a danger of allowing the killer to become the center of the story. His name becomes famous. His photograph becomes recognizable. His methods become discussed. His psychology becomes analyzed. But the women he killed can become footnotes. That should never happen. The places they lived were not simply crime scenes. They were homes. They contained ordinary lives. A woman might have had a favorite chair, a drawer filled with personal things, a stack of letters, a calendar with appointments, a photograph of someone she loved, clothes waiting for the next morning, a grocery list, a half-finished book, all the small evidence of a life in progress. Those objects are easy to overlook when a crime becomes a headline, but they are the details that make a victim human. And in this case, humanity matters because the killer's actions depended on stripping away that humanity. He did not see the women as complete lives. He saw them through the lens of his own compulsions. He watched. He selected. He approached. He controlled. And eventually he killed. The distance between those actions is where the psychology of the case becomes important. A person does not wake up one morning and suddenly possess a complete method for serial murder. Behavior can develop. Fantasies can become more elaborate. Boundaries can erode. The unacceptable can become normalized inside someone's private thoughts. And when those thoughts are repeatedly indulged, the threshold between imagination and action can become dangerously thin. Johnson's history suggested that his sexual interests had already become deeply disturbed before the murders. But the eventual violence went far beyond fantasy. Real women were involved. Real homes were entered. Real families were destroyed. That is the point at which psychological explanation must never become an excuse. Understanding why a person behaves a certain way is not the same as removing responsibility for what he does. That question would become central to the courtroom years later. Was Johnson capable of understanding his actions? Could he control them? Did his mental condition make him legally responsible? Or did it fundamentally alter his ability to distinguish right from wrong? Those questions belong to another chapter. For now, the important thing is the environment in which the crimes occurred. Ontario in the 1970s. A world where information moved slowly. A world where investigators relied heavily on physical evidence and witness memory. A world without the instant connectivity people now take for granted. A world where a person could move from one neighborhood to another without leaving a digital footprint. And a world where an apartment balcony could be both a private sanctuary and an unnoticed point of entry. That world gave Johnson opportunity. But opportunity alone does not create a killer. The opportunity had to meet the desire. And the desire had already been developing inside him. The first deaths would reveal what happened when those two forces came together. Mary Catherine Hicks. Alice Ralston. Eleanor Hartwick. Doris Brown. 4 women. 4 deaths. And 4 opportunities for the authorities to see something that had not yet become visible. The killer was not standing outside the police station demanding attention. He was not taunting investigators. He was not leaving messages. He was relying on something much more effective. Silence. The kind of silence that settles over an apartment after midnight. The kind of silence that makes every room feel empty. The kind of silence in which a person can sleep without ever knowing someone else is nearby. That silence would eventually be broken. But before it was, Russell Johnson would have time. Time to watch. Time to learn. Time to become more confident. And time for another woman to become the center of the story. Her name was Diane Beets. She was 23 years old. She was engaged. She had a future planned. And on December 30th, 1974, she had every reason to believe that the next morning would be ordinary. The next morning would not be ordinary. It would become the morning when a quiet series of unexplained deaths began to reveal the possibility of something far more sinister. It would become the moment when a bedroom ceased to be merely a bedroom. It would become evidence. And the city would begin to ask a question that had not been asked before. What if these women did not simply die? What if someone had killed them? That question would change everything. Because once investigators began looking at the deaths as possible crimes, the past could no longer remain buried beneath ordinary explanations. The names would have to be brought together. The dates would have to be compared. The addresses would have to be mapped. The victims would have to be remembered. And somewhere within those connections, if the investigators were patient enough, they might find the man who had been hiding in plain sight. But first, they had to understand the world he had been moving through. They had to understand the buildings, the streets, the routines, the balconies, the bedrooms, the spaces between neighbors, the places where nobody was watching. Because Russell Johnson's greatest advantage was not that he could disappear. It was that the world around him had been designed to let ordinary people remain unseen. And for a man with something terrible to hide, that was enough. For a while. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the buildings where these women lived. That was precisely the problem. They were not abandoned warehouses. They were not isolated houses at the end of forgotten roads. They were ordinary residential buildings, surrounded by ordinary streets, occupied by ordinary people. The kind of places where lights appeared in windows every evening. The kind of places where someone could carry groceries through a front entrance while another resident held the door open. The kind of places where people knew the sound of an elevator arriving, the footsteps of a neighbor in the hallway, the familiar closing of a door somewhere above them. And yet, behind those ordinary walls, people could live completely separate lives. A building could contain dozens of people and still offer an extraordinary amount of privacy. That contradiction would become central to the story. A person living on the 4th floor could look down at the sidewalk and see people moving below like small figures. From that height, the street seemed far away. Safe. Disconnected. The higher the apartment, the greater the illusion of protection. A locked front entrance. A stairwell. An elevator. A hallway. A private door. A bedroom. Each layer seemed to place another barrier between the resident and the outside world. But barriers only work when the person trying to enter is forced to use the same path as everyone else. Russell Johnson did not always need to. He could approach from somewhere people were not expecting. A balcony. A window. The side of a building. The exterior of an apartment could become a second entrance, one that residents rarely thought about because they assumed nobody would use it. That assumption was understandable. Most people do not look at the outside wall of a building and imagine a man climbing it at night. They do not examine the distance between balconies. They do not wonder whether someone could reach their floor from another direction. They do not inspect every possible angle from which a stranger might observe their home. They simply live there. That is what homes are supposed to allow us to do. Forget the outside world. In the 1970s, this sense of privacy was even stronger. There was no constant digital connection between people. There were telephones, but they stayed in homes. There were newspapers, but information arrived after events had already happened. There were televisions, but they showed the world at scheduled times. There was no device in a person's pocket quietly transmitting their location. No camera on every corner. No instant message from a friend asking whether they had arrived safely. If someone left home, they could simply disappear into the movement of the city until they returned. That freedom was part of everyday life. It was also an advantage for someone who wanted to watch without being watched. Johnson could observe without leaving behind the kind of trail that modern investigators might expect. He could move through streets without a digital record. He could approach buildings without triggering an electronic alarm. He could see a woman return home and rely on memory rather than a camera. If someone noticed him, there was always the possibility that they would forget. A man standing near an apartment building was not automatically suspicious. A man walking down a street at night was not automatically suspicious. A man sitting in a car was not automatically suspicious. There were thousands of reasons for an ordinary person to be in an ordinary place. That gave Johnson another layer of protection. He did not have to look like a criminal. He only had to look like someone who belonged there. And people tend to remember what is unusual. They forget what is ordinary. That is one of the most basic weaknesses of human observation. We cannot remember everyone. We cannot examine every face. We cannot treat every stranger as a potential threat. If we did, ordinary life would become impossible. So we make assumptions. The man walking down the sidewalk is probably going somewhere. The person entering the building probably lives there. The car parked nearby probably belongs to someone visiting a resident. The figure on the balcony is probably a neighbor. Most of the time, those assumptions are correct. A predator survives inside that majority. He depends on the fact that 99 ordinary explanations can hide one extraordinary truth. That truth was beginning to take shape around Russell Johnson. But the people around him did not know it. They saw a man. Not a serial killer. Not the future subject of a criminal investigation. Not the person who would eventually be connected to 7 women's deaths. Just a man. That distinction is important because the word killer changes the way we see everything that came before it. Once we know what someone did, ordinary behavior can appear sinister. A photograph can suddenly seem disturbing. A casual smile can look false. A normal conversation can appear calculated. But that is hindsight. At the time, people did not possess the information we have now. They could not see the future. They could only see the present. And the present looked ordinary. Johnson could therefore exist inside the community without carrying an obvious warning label. He could work. He could exercise. He could speak with people. He could enter public places. He could return to his apartment. And all the while, another side of his life was developing. That division between public and private would become one of the most disturbing themes of the case. There was the man others could see. And there was the man who existed when nobody else was watching. The private world was where his fantasies and obsessions could grow. The public world provided camouflage. Between the two was a door. A door that could close. A door that could separate one identity from another. The victims, meanwhile, had no such separation. Their homes were their private worlds. When they closed the door, they believed the outside world stayed outside. That belief is so deeply embedded in human behavior that most people never consciously think about it. You close the door. You lock it. You put down your keys. You remove your coat. You enter your bedroom. The ritual is almost automatic. Security becomes something you assume, rather than something you constantly verify. And that is why the idea of an intruder entering from a balcony is so disturbing. It violates the architecture of trust. The victim is not simply attacked. Her understanding of safety is betrayed. The place she believed was closed to strangers was not closed. The boundary she believed existed did not exist. And once that boundary disappears, every memory of home can change. The balcony where someone once stood drinking coffee can become frightening. The sliding door that once brought fresh air into the room can become a source of anxiety. The bedroom window can become something to avoid looking toward at night. A home can remain physically unchanged while becoming emotionally unrecognizable. That is one of the invisible consequences of a crime like this. The killer leaves. But the fear stays. For families, it can stay even longer. They may return to the building where their daughter lived. They may stand outside and look up. They may wonder whether the killer had stood there before. Whether he had watched. Whether he had chosen the apartment deliberately. Whether he knew the victim's schedule. Whether she ever noticed him. Those questions do not have easy answers. And in many cases, they never will. But there was a time when none of those questions existed. There was only normal life. Diane Beats had that normal life. Luella Jean George had that normal life. Donna Veldboom had that normal life. The other women did too. Their apartments were not crime scenes when they first moved into them. They were homes. Places where people planned their evenings. Places where they kept personal belongings. Places where they expected to wake up the next morning. That expectation is easy to overlook when telling a crime story. But it is the most important thing to remember. Victims do not live their lives knowing they are victims. They do not walk toward the ending with a narrator warning them that danger is coming. They make plans. They make mistakes. They laugh. They become tired. They worry about money. They fall in love. They argue. They make appointments. They postpone chores. They leave laundry soaking in a bathtub. They promise to call someone later. They believe there will be a later. That is what makes Diane's story so painful. On December 30th, 1974, she had reason to think about the future. She was engaged. She was planning a wedding. The date was not some distant fantasy. May was coming. There would have been decisions to make. Things to buy. People to tell. Plans to arrange. A life was taking shape. And then the next day, that future disappeared. The apartment remained. The plans remained. The clothing remained. The laundry remained. But Diane was gone. And somewhere in the building, the person responsible was also gone. The killer did not remain beside the body. He did not wait for the police. He left. He returned to ordinary life. That is another advantage of an urban environment. Movement. People are constantly coming and going. A person can leave one building and enter another. He can turn a corner. He can cross a street. He can enter a car. He can disappear among people who have no reason to stop him. The city absorbs movement. It is almost designed for it. That is why investigators often depend on witnesses. Someone must have seen something. Someone must remember. Someone must have noticed the unusual car, the unfamiliar man, the strange movement, the light that came on, the door that opened. But what if nobody understands that what they saw mattered? A witness might see a man near a building and think nothing of it. Later, after a murder, that same memory might become important. But memory does not preserve every detail. People remember events differently depending on what they believe at the time. Before a murder, a man standing outside an apartment is just a man. After a murder, he becomes a possible suspect. The meaning changes. The memory may change with it. That was the environment investigators were working within. They had to reconstruct events from fragments. And fragments are fragile. A witness remembers a vehicle. A neighbor remembers seeing someone. A family member remembers the victim's routine. A medical examiner records physical findings. An investigator writes down what was reported. Each piece enters a file. But the killer exists outside the file. He is not yet connected to the evidence. He is simply moving. That separation creates a dangerous gap. And Johnson lived inside that gap for years. There was also another problem. The early deaths did not immediately look like murders. This meant investigators were not collecting evidence under the assumption that a serial offender was involved. The distinction cannot be overstated. When investigators believe they are dealing with murder, they search differently. They ask different questions. They preserve different evidence. They look for a suspect. They examine entry points. They consider motive. They search for connections to other crimes. But when a death appears natural, the investigation follows a different path. Medical history becomes important. Medication becomes important. Age becomes important. Existing health conditions become important. The room itself may not be treated as a crime scene. And if there is no crime scene, there may be no reason to search for an intruder. That is how a false conclusion can become a shield around a killer. It does not require corruption. It does not require incompetence. It requires only an incorrect interpretation of the available evidence. And sometimes the evidence itself is misleading. A bedroom can conceal violence. A body can conceal violence. A quiet room can conceal violence. The absence of obvious struggle does not necessarily mean the absence of a struggle. The absence of broken furniture does not necessarily mean nobody entered. The absence of witnesses does not mean nobody was there. It simply means the evidence is harder to see. Johnson's method exploited that difficulty. He did not necessarily create chaos. He could leave a room looking almost normal. That normality was powerful. It allowed him to leave behind uncertainty rather than certainty. A detective arriving at a chaotic scene knows immediately that something has happened. A detective arriving at a quiet bedroom must first decide what kind of event they are looking at. And that decision can determine everything that follows. For the women connected to Johnson's early crimes, that difference may have meant years of unanswered questions. For Johnson, it meant freedom. He had found an environment where the truth could hide behind appearances. And there was another advantage. The victims did not necessarily know him. That meant there was no obvious personal connection to investigate. If a woman is killed by her husband, boyfriend, business partner, or known enemy, investigators have an immediate direction. But a stranger entering through a balcony creates a much larger suspect pool. Anyone could be responsible. The killer does not have to explain why he knew the victim. He may not have known her at all. He may simply have watched. That creates a terrifying imbalance. The victim's life is an open book to the stalker. The stalker's life is invisible to the victim. She may not know his name. She may never have spoken to him. She may never have noticed him. Yet he can know where she lives. That is a form of power. Not physical power. Information. The power of knowing while remaining unknown. And once that power is combined with patience, it can become deadly. Johnson's behavior suggests that he understood patience. The waiting mattered. He did not need to attack every woman he observed. He could choose. He could wait for conditions that suited him. He could watch. And when he finally acted, the victim might have no idea why she had been selected. This is one reason it is dangerous to search for a simple motive in serial murder. The victim may not have done anything. She may not have angered the killer. She may not have known him. She may simply have fit what he was looking for. That reality is cruel because it removes the illusion that victims can always protect themselves by behaving differently. Sometimes there is no behavior that would have changed the killer's intention. The responsibility belongs to the person who chose to harm them. The cities themselves were not responsible. The buildings were not responsible. The victims were not responsible. The failure to recognize a pattern was not a moral failure by the people who did not yet have the information. The person who chose to cross the boundary was responsible for crossing it. But understanding the environment helps explain why he could do it. And the environment was full of blind spots. Hallways. Stairwells. Parking areas. Balconies. Dark windows. Unfamiliar faces. Private bedrooms. These were the spaces between observation. The spaces where someone could be present without being noticed. And Johnson learned how to move through them. By 1974, the city had already given him time. For women were dead. Then Diane Beats. Her murder changed the emotional temperature of the investigation. Now there was undeniable violence. Now there was a reason to be afraid. A killer was no longer a theoretical possibility. A killer was real. Somewhere. And he had entered a woman's home. Police began searching for clues. A dark-colored Buick had reportedly been noticed near the building. A reward was offered. The public was given reason to pay attention. For a moment, the city might have felt as though the danger had become visible. But visibility is not the same as identification. People could know there was a killer without knowing who he was. That difference kept Johnson free. The city had a problem. But it did not yet have a face. And without a face, fear has nowhere to settle. People may become cautious. They may lock doors more carefully. They may look twice at strangers. But eventually routine returns. People cannot remain afraid forever. Life demands normality. Work must continue. Bills must be paid. Children must be cared for. Classes must be attended. Relationships must continue. The city cannot freeze because a murderer is somewhere within it. So people adapt. And killers can adapt with them. The years that followed would prove that. After Diane's murder, the story did not immediately end. The killer did not vanish from the world. He remained. Waiting. Living. Watching. And by the time 1977 arrived, the city had changed. But some things had not. People still lived in apartments. People still trusted locked doors. People still slept behind glass. And Russell Johnson still knew how to move through that world. Then Luella Jean George was killed. Her death would begin to narrow the distance between the killer and the investigation. And after her, Donna Veldboom would be found dead. This time, the victim lived directly above Johnson. The geography of the case would become almost unbearable. The man downstairs. The woman upstairs. The same building. The same enclosed space. A predator no longer operating somewhere across the city. He was living almost directly beneath his next victim. And that proximity would eventually become his weakness. Because the closer a killer moves to his victims, the more opportunities he creates for evidence. The same environment that once protected him could begin working against him. A building that once provided anonymity could become a trap. A neighbor could remember. An object could be found. A movement could be traced. A routine could be reconstructed. And a man who believed he understood the environment could discover that the environment had begun to reveal him. The city had not changed into a safer place. The killer had simply made himself easier to see. But before the final pieces came together, there was still a question nobody could answer. How many women had he watched? How many had he followed? How many apartments had he studied? How many times had he stood outside a building and then walked away? How many nights had someone gone to sleep without knowing that a stranger had been watching from outside? There is no complete answer. And perhaps there never will be. What investigators eventually uncovered was only the part of the story that could be connected to evidence, confession, and known deaths. The rest disappeared into the darkness of the years. That is the unsettling truth about serial predators. The known number is often only the number that can be proven. Behind it may be other victims, other attacks, other women who were frightened but survived, other incidents that were never connected, other deaths whose explanations were never questioned. In Johnson's case, investigators would eventually hear about other sexual assaults and disturbing behavior. But 7 women became the core of the murder story. 7 lives. And before the police understood the full number, each woman had existed alone in the world of her own life. That is where the next chapter must go. Away from the killer. Away from the architecture. Away from the city. Toward the women themselves. Because before we examine how they died, we have to understand how they lived. Mary Catherine Hicks was not a body in a bedroom. She was 20 years old. Alice Ralston was not a line in an old investigation file. She was 42. Eleanor Hartwick was not merely another unexplained death. She was 27. Doris Brown was someone's mother. Diane Beats was a young woman planning a wedding. Luella Jean George was 23. Donna Veldboom was 22. Their ages were different. Their lives were different. Their dreams were different. But one thing connected them. They expected another morning. And the man who took that morning away from them did not have the right to decide when their lives would end. That is why the next part of this story cannot begin with the killer. It must begin with the people he left behind. The families. The friends. The partners. The people who knew these women before their names became associated with a crime. Because the most important question is not simply how Russell Johnson killed. It is who Russell Johnson killed. And to answer that, we have to go back before the bedrooms became crime scenes. Back before the police tape. Back before the headlines. Back before the word serial entered the story. Back to the ordinary lives of 7 women who believed they had time. Time to wake up. Time to make plans. Time to fall in love. Time to grow older. Time to become someone they had not yet imagined. They did not know that a man was watching. They did not know that their homes could be entered from unexpected places. They did not know that some of the deaths around them were connected. They did not know that the ordinary world they trusted was beginning to hide something extraordinary. They only knew the life in front of them. And that life deserves to be remembered. There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs to a city at night. It is not complete darkness. There are streetlights. There are illuminated windows. There are headlights passing through intersections. There are signs glowing above businesses, and the occasional light moving across a curtain. The city is never entirely asleep. It simply becomes selective about what it reveals. A few rooms remain bright while others disappear into blackness. One apartment may be alive with conversation while the apartment next door is completely silent. Someone may be eating dinner 3 floors above a person who has already gone to bed. Someone may be returning from work while another resident is turning off the last light in the apartment. Thousands of private moments unfold at the same time, separated by walls. That was London and Guelph in the 1970s. Not a city waiting for a killer. A city simply living. And that distinction matters. Crime stories often begin at the moment the ordinary world is shattered. But for the people living there, the world was ordinary until it wasn't. The buildings did not announce danger. The streets did not announce danger. The balconies did not announce danger. A bedroom was still a bedroom. A bed was still a place to sleep. A locked door was still something people trusted. The danger existed in the gap between what people believed and what was actually possible. Russell Johnson understood that gap. Perhaps more importantly, he understood that most people did not spend their lives thinking about the possibility of someone entering through a 4th-floor balcony. Why would they? To do so would require imagining something outside the normal range of human behavior. It would require imagining a stranger who was willing to climb the exterior of a building. A stranger who had watched the apartment. A stranger who knew when the resident was home. A stranger who was willing to cross a physical boundary that most people would consider impossible. The human mind protects itself from endless fear by assuming that certain things will not happen. That assumption is necessary. Without it, everyday life would become unbearable. You could never sleep. You could never walk down a street. You could never trust a stranger. You could never leave a window open. You could never sit alone in your own home without considering every possible threat. So people choose normality. They choose to believe the locked door will remain locked. They choose to believe the balcony is too high to be reached. They choose to believe that a person walking past the building is simply walking past. Most of the time, they are right. But serial predators survive in the exceptions. Johnson was one of those exceptions. His behavior transformed ordinary architecture into something else. A balcony became a route. A bedroom became a target. A sleeping woman became vulnerable. A building became a map. The distance between one floor and another became irrelevant. The darkness became cover. And the quiet became an ally. That does not mean the city itself was dangerous. It means the city contained opportunities that most people never considered. Every environment contains opportunities. A parking lot. A stairwell. A deserted road. A crowded train station. A private home. The danger comes from the person who knows how to exploit them. Johnson's ability to move through these spaces appears to have depended heavily on observation. Observation is not dramatic. There is no cinematic moment when a killer decides to watch someone. It can be as simple as noticing a routine. A woman leaves her apartment at the same time every morning. She returns at roughly the same hour. A particular visitor arrives on weekends. A light goes off at night. A balcony door remains accessible. The details accumulate. To the victim, they are meaningless. To someone watching her, they become information. That difference creates an invisible relationship. One person knows that the relationship exists. The other does not. The victim continues living normally because she does not know she is being observed. The observer becomes increasingly familiar with her life without ever becoming part of it. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of stalking. It allows the predator to construct an intimacy that the victim never agreed to. He knows where she lives. He may know when she sleeps. He may know when she leaves. He may know who visits. He may know which lights turn off first. Yet she may not even recognize his face. He knows her. She does not know him. And when violence enters the picture, that imbalance becomes deadly. There is also something psychologically important about watching someone sleep. Sleep represents helplessness. A sleeping person is not actively evaluating threats. She is not scanning the room. She is not listening for every movement. Her attention is turned inward. The body is vulnerable. The mind is elsewhere. For an offender whose fantasies revolve around control, that vulnerability can become part of the attraction. The victim is unaware. The offender is fully aware. The power imbalance becomes absolute. That is not intimacy. It is domination. And in Johnson's case, domination would eventually become connected to sexual violence and murder. The women could not see that process unfolding. They were simply going to sleep. That is why the bedroom appears repeatedly in this story. The bedroom is where people become most vulnerable without realizing it. It is also where the evidence of a person's life is often most personal. Clothing, books, photographs, letters, cosmetics, personal belongings. Everything that tells you who someone is when nobody else is watching. A bedroom can be an autobiography without words. When investigators enter such a room after a death, they are not simply looking at a body. They are entering someone's private world after that person has been removed from it. That creates an unsettling contrast. The room remains full of life while the person is gone. A jacket still hangs where it was left. A pair of shoes remains near the bed. A book may be open. Clothes may be waiting to be worn. A calendar may contain future plans. The future can remain physically present even after the person who imagined it is dead. This would be especially painful in the case of Diane Beats. She had a future that was unusually concrete. She was engaged to James Britton. They had discussed marriage. There was a wedding date. There was a ring. There were plans. The future had already begun to take physical form. Then, within a day, those plans became artifacts. The ring no longer represented an upcoming wedding. It represented a future that would never happen. That transformation is one of the cruelest things murder can do. It does not only take a life. It destroys possibilities. A birthday that will never arrive. A wedding that will never happen. A child who will never be born. A conversation that will never take place. A person does not need to have lived a famous life for that loss to be enormous. Every human life contains possibilities. When someone is murdered, all of them disappear at once. For investigators, those possibilities become irrelevant to the evidence. But for families, they remain painfully present. That is why the human story must remain at the center. The case files would eventually contain dates, names, addresses, medical findings, statements, confessions, legal arguments. But behind every page was a person, and behind every person were people who loved her. The first 4 women connected to Johnson's eventual confessions had something else in common. Their deaths were initially interpreted through the lens of ordinary mortality. That fact is easy to understand when we remember how people think about death. People die from illness. They die from age. They die from medical complications. They die unexpectedly. A death does not automatically mean murder. The assumption of natural causes is often the most reasonable assumption. That is why the first deaths could pass without immediately producing a homicide investigation. But a serial killer does not need everyone to believe he is innocent. He only needs them to believe there is another explanation. That is enough. An unexplained death can sit quietly in a file. The victim's family can grieve. The funeral can take place. The apartment can eventually be cleaned. The belongings can be divided. Life moves forward. Meanwhile, the person responsible remains free. And if the killer understands that, he may become more confident. There is a particular danger in successful concealment. The first crime creates fear. The second crime creates confidence. If the second crime is also concealed, the offender learns something about the world. He learns that his method works. That lesson can influence what comes next. We cannot know exactly what Johnson thought after each death. We cannot enter his mind. We should not pretend to know emotions or intentions that the evidence cannot establish. But his continued behavior shows that whatever barriers existed between fantasy and violence had weakened. The crimes continued, and each new victim added another layer to the story. By 1974, the case was no longer simply about unexplained deaths. Diane Beats changed that. Her murder was visibly different. The bedroom was no longer simply a place where someone had died. It was a crime scene. The body showed evidence of restraint. There were signs of sexual assault. The method of killing was more apparent. There was a reason for investigators to consider an intruder. And with that possibility came another. If someone had entered Diane's apartment, had he entered other apartments? If Diane had been watched, had other women been watched? If this was not the first murder, where was the first? The questions multiplied. But answers did not arrive quickly. A dark-colored Buick was noticed near the building. A reward was offered. Investigators looked for information. People were asked to remember. And the city began to understand that there was a person capable of entering a woman's home and killing her. Fear changes behavior. People look at strangers differently. A sound outside the window feels different. A balcony door becomes something to check. A woman walking alone may look over her shoulder. A man standing near an apartment building may suddenly seem more noticeable. But fear is difficult to maintain indefinitely. Eventually, people return to routine. They have to. And the killer can return to routine too. That may be the most disturbing feature of the entire story. The killer does not live in a permanently dark world. He lives in the same world as everyone else. He sees daylight. He buys food. He speaks to people. He walks through public places. He may laugh. He may appear relaxed. He may look entirely ordinary. There is no visible mark identifying him as someone capable of murder. The darkness is inside the behavior, not on the face. This is why communities often struggle to understand after an arrest. People say things like, "He seemed normal." Of course he did. If he had seemed obviously dangerous, someone might have intervened. The ability to appear normal is not proof of innocence. It is simply proof that people are complicated. And that complexity would become central to Johnson's case. When psychiatric experts later examined him, the legal system would have to confront a difficult question. What happens when a person commits horrific acts while suffering from severe psychological disturbance? Where does illness end and responsibility begin? Can an impulse become so powerful that a person loses meaningful control? Can someone understand that murder is wrong and still feel unable to stop himself? Can the law punish a person who is considered mentally incapable of being criminally responsible? These were not abstract questions. They were questions attached to dead women. The courtroom would eventually have to balance medical testimony against the reality of what happened. But in the 1970s, nobody in the city knew that such questions were coming. Nobody knew that Russell Johnson would eventually become the subject of a psychiatric and legal battle. At that time, the story was still fragmented. A death here. A murder there. A woman attacked. A suspect unknown. A city moving forward. The connection existed, but it had not yet been fully recognized. And the killer had one more advantage. Time. Time allows memories to fade. It allows buildings to change. It allows witnesses to move away. It allows people to forget details. It allows old cases to become old cases. But time can also work against a killer. Every new crime creates new evidence. Every new victim creates new witnesses. Every new investigation creates another opportunity for investigators to compare information. The longer a pattern continues, the greater the possibility that something will overlap. A vehicle. A location. A method. An object. A name. A face. A neighbor. A routine. Eventually, the separate pieces may begin to touch. That is what happened as the years progressed. Johnson's crimes were not occurring in an empty universe. Every action left some kind of trace. The challenge was recognizing which traces mattered. And that challenge became greater because some of the traces were not immediately visible as evidence. An object discarded near an apartment might mean nothing, until investigators realize it belonged to a murder victim. A person living in a nearby apartment might seem irrelevant, until another victim is found in the same building. A man's unusual movement might be forgotten, until someone realizes that another witness saw him in another place. Crime investigation is often less like discovering one giant clue and more like assembling hundreds of tiny pieces. Most pieces are useless. Some pieces are misleading. A few are essential. The investigator does not know which is which at first. That uncertainty can be exhausting. It requires patience. It requires skepticism. It requires the willingness to revisit conclusions that once seemed settled. And in the Johnson case, revisiting the past would become crucial. Because the most disturbing discovery was not simply that a new murder had occurred. It was that older deaths might have been misunderstood. The past was not dead. It was waiting. Waiting inside old reports. Waiting inside memories. Waiting inside the statements of a man who would eventually begin talking. But before that happened, there was still the question of the victims. Their names had existed long before Johnson's name became attached to them. They had families. They had friendships. They had routines. They had personalities that cannot be reconstructed completely from a crime file. That limitation should be acknowledged. There are some lives that history records only in fragments. A newspaper article may tell us when someone died. A police report may tell us where. A court record may tell us how. But none of those documents can fully capture who a person was when she was alive. A woman can be reduced to an age. A date. A location. A cause of death. That reduction is necessary for legal documentation. It is not enough for remembrance. The story must therefore slow down. The investigation can wait. The killer can wait. The courtroom can wait. Before any of that, there were women living ordinary lives in Ontario. Mary Catherine Hicks was 20. Alice Ralston was 42. Eleanor Hartwick was 27. Doris Brown was 49. Diane Beats was 23. Luella Jean George was 23. Donna Veldboom was 22. 7 women. 7 different lives. 7 different sets of people who would eventually have to learn how to live with an absence that should never have existed. And there is something else they shared. None of them knew the story they were becoming part of. They could not have known that years later, investigators would place their names beside one another. They could not have known that their deaths would become evidence in a serial murder investigation. They could not have known that the man responsible would eventually sit before a judge. They could not have known that psychiatrists would examine his mind. They could not have known that lawyers would debate his responsibility. They could not have known that decades later, people would still discuss what happened. At the time, they were simply living. That is how we should remember them. Not as the 7 women who died at the hands of Russell Johnson, but as 7 people whose lives were interrupted by him. The distinction is small in language. It is enormous in meaning. The killer is not the center of their existence. He entered their stories. He did not create them. Their stories began before him, and they deserve to be told before the violence. So we leave the streets for a moment. We leave the balconies. We leave the apartment buildings. We leave the investigation files. We step away from the man who would later become known as the bedroom strangler. And we turn toward the women, toward their families, toward the lives that existed before the murders. Because a crime story becomes something more than a sequence of deaths when we remember what was taken.